Hello, everyone. So I wanted to talk about what has been going on since the Dobbs ruling that the Supreme Court made this summer that essentially overturned Roe v. Wade and basically said that there is no constitutional right to an abortion provided by the federal government. And what I basically wanted to discuss is the reaction that I've seen from Democratic Party officials and the left in general, and how this is a major problem that could come back in the future to potentially bite conservatives in the butt. And basically what has happened is Biden, Nancy Pelosi, and many others have said, well, the Supreme Court basically said that there's no federal guarantee of abortion rights of convenience for women. So we're going to come out now and just say that we're going to guarantee it anyway. We're going to do whatever we can at the federal level to give women in different states the right to an abortion, even though the Constitution has been interpreted by the Supreme Court, that's their job, to have essentially no guarantee for this. We're going to provide it anyway, even though that's not within the scope of federal powers, according to the ruling that has just been handed down through the Dobbs case. The problem with that is that this sets up a major confrontation later on where the Supreme Court basically has the power and authority to interpret the Constitution totally neutralized. So let me explain what I mean by that. I want to start off by saying that I don't believe there is and has ever been any sort of right to abortion of convenience within the Constitution. The rationale that the court had to use in Roe v. Wade was just so pretty much grasping at straws and so much about just inventing rights that don't exist by trying to say that there's a right to privacy, which there are definitely parts of the Constitution that relate to individual privacy, but to say that that's somehow connected to a woman just having an abortion and destroying her fetus, I'm not going to go into, all the controversial language and aspects of that, but it's just there is no right to an abortion. There's no way to connect privacy with doctors being able to just say, well, we've determined that this woman has the right to end her fetus's life now. There's no real connection there. And so there's never been anything behind that within the Constitution itself, within that framework. It's always just been something that was invented as a method or a form of judicial activism. So really, Roe should have never happened in the first place based on what the Constitution and its contents actually say. There's nothing about reproductive rights or reproduction at all within the Constitution. There's no information about that whatsoever. So to say that the Constitution protected those rights to begin with, again, it was just judicial activism from the beginning. And so Dobbs basically sets that straight, in my opinion. And basically now you see other Democratic officials, or you see Pelosi and Biden and others say that, well, we're going to protect these rights anyway. In my view, if you look at what the left has become today, and I try to be fair with how I criticize conservatives at times as well, but you don't really see this on the right. Only the left actually wants to take away your real constitutional rights. And you see this with things like hate speech laws. You see this with things like, even though there have been Republicans that have supported red flag laws, in general, gun control is something that the left and the Democratic Party in the United States totally pushes for every opportunity they can, right? You see due process rights being taken away and eroded with things like believe all women and listen and believe and all the Me Too stuff, that men don't really deserve to have due process rights, for example, if a woman makes an accusation against a man. It is the feminist left, it is the left in general that supports that mentality. And so my belief is that the left, if they can, your leftist politicians and the movement on the left in general wants to basically dismantle and completely take away your constitutional rights and freedoms. If they were capable of doing that now, they already would have. They don't want you to have free speech and due process and all the other rights that the Constitution of the United States wants to preserve. And you see in other countries where there's been a lot more success at taking away your basic rights and freedoms, coming from the left. In general, the right doesn't want to do this. You can criticize maybe certain factions on the right, but for the most part, they are all about preserving individual choice and constitutional rights and your basic freedoms. So, in my view, what could easily happen here is just an attempt in the future to just neutralize any sort of ruling that the Supreme Court makes about your constitutional rights. And of course, there have been times, like with the Roe case, in my opinion, where the Supreme Court has not done its job well and not really protected or interpreted certain aspects of the Constitution correctly and has not protected people's rights in certain cases. But it's definitely true that the Supreme Court is really the only entity that can protect your constitutional rights. That's their whole job. As a Supreme Court justice, you are supposed to uphold people's rights through interpreting the Constitution in a way to accomplish that in a legal way. That's the whole purpose of the court, pretty much. And so what I fear happening in the future is you will have a case where someone's actual constitutional rights are under threat, but the Supreme Court is just being ignored at that point. The Supreme Court can no longer really defend your rights. And basically what could happen is the left could use the abortion issue as an excuse to further this goal of taking people's constitutional rights away by neutralizing the power of the Supreme Court to protect those rights. So let's say that you have a state that is kind of a toss-up / battleground state in terms of whether the conservatives or the left dominate the politics in that state. And let's say you have a woman that wants an abortion of convenience. Let's say that there's a federal law that's passed by Biden or whoever else in the future, and I'm going to get to that later in terms of the laws that may exist in the future to allow this to happen. But let's just say that there's a federal law that says women are allowed to have abortions of convenience, and that flies in the face. Congress passes a law like that, or there's an executive order to provide that from the Biden administration. And let's say that flies in the face of the Supreme Court's ruling in Dobbs. Well, let's say in a battleground state or a state that's not dominated by conservatives or the left, that's sort of an area where there's a struggle for power. Let's say there is a conservative law concerning abortion, that a woman cannot have an abortion of convenience in that state after a period of time. And let's say that a woman sues to be able to do that anyway, to be able to have an abortion even though she's not legally, according to the state law, able to do that. Well, then the lower court, the state level court, would have a choice. Basically, if you have leftist judges on that court that have managed to get elected because it's a state that may have a sort of a conservative law, but let's say that the demographics have shifted enough to allow leftist judges to get on that court, now they decide that they're going to rule that, you know what, the Supreme Court says that you're not supposed to be allowed to have an abortion if the state law requires this, but we're going to say that this federal law that the Biden administration or Congress has supported supersedes that, even though it shouldn't. We're going to ignore the Supreme Court, basically, and we're going to go with the federal statute. We're going to go with this law that says the federal government does guarantee your right to an abortion, and we're going to say that basically the state law cannot supersede the federal law because that is generally established. So we're just going to say you can have the abortion anyway, and we're going to ignore the Supreme Court ruling that the federal legislation is actually unconstitutional and that they shouldn't have been allowed to pass something like that in the first place. We're going to say instead that you have to ignore the state law. Well, guess what? You've just established a situation where the Supreme Court can just be ignored now because Congress or the executive branch now has the power to make these decisions. And through that process, now if you have something else that comes up, and this is the main point that I'm getting to, let's say that your guns have been taken away for no reason other than you're conservative or somebody doesn't like you in a position of power. Well, now the Supreme Court could decide, well, hey, you can't do that. The Supreme Court could rule that you're not allowed to take people's gun rights away at a basic level because of the Second Amendment. Doesn't matter. We're just going to ignore what the Supreme Court says now. Let's say that you then have a leftist state that passes a hate speech law. that says that you can't say anything against a particular group of people. Well, in that case, the Supreme Court would decide, assuming that it has a similar makeup as now, right? Assuming that you still have a fairly conservative number of members on the Supreme Court, and they say that no, you can't have a hate speech law that restricts free speech just because it offends a particular group of people. That doesn't make it illegal. You can't fine someone or send someone to jail because of that. Well, we'll just ignore that because we say it's hate speech anyway. Once you establish a precedent for just ignoring Supreme Court rulings, you're done. There is no entity left that can protect your constitutional rights anymore. And so what I think is potentially a danger in, probably not right now, and I'm going to get to the timing of this in just a minute, but in the next decade or two, perhaps, what could happen is there is a challenge to some sort of federal abortion legislation that's not constitutional, that tries to protect women's right to an abortion anyway. And then basically the end result is that we ignore the Supreme Court now. Well, if that's what takes place, there's nothing left that prevents any other issue that is decided by the Supreme Court from essentially leading to that result. If the Supreme Court says this, but we're just going to ignore whatever their ruling is, we don't care. We're not going to pay attention to them. And so what I think the left is going to try to do is they are going to try to turn people against the Supreme Court itself, their voter base. They're going to try to convince people that they're protecting women's rights and all that kind of nonsense because the general gynocentric environment encourages people to think that way anyway. They're potentially going to decide that, well, we're protecting women's rights by ignoring the Supreme Court's ruling because they're not treating women fairly or something of that sort. And so we're just going to pass this federal legislation anyway through Congress or through an executive order. And then we're going to encourage the lower courts to listen to us instead of the Supreme Court. And if they can get the majority of voters behind that, if they can get most people to foolishly, in my opinion, think that they're somehow doing the right thing by ignoring what the Supreme Court has ruled in the Dobbs case, you're done. Once you get to the point where everyone's okay with that, or the majority of people are doing that, and conservatives essentially don't oppose this, conservatives just do what they, in my view, typically do, which is basically nothing, you're done in terms of having any of your rights protected, because now you have this pathway for just ignoring whatever the Supreme Court says whenever the ruling party doesn't like it. They could set a precedent, the left, for upending or ignoring all of our rights across the board, regardless of any rulings that the Supreme Court may actually pass that should be legally binding, or may actually hand down that should be legally binding. And so my sort of conclusion of this is anyone that opposes the left's policies needs to be aware of what Democrats might be trying to do here. That even though conservatives essentially won this battle to have Roe overturned, that if the left and the Democrats can, at some point, decide that we're just going to defy that, and we're just going to do what we want anyway, and we're going to directly challenge the court's power, and they succeed at convincing most people, most of their voter base to go along with that, we're screwed. In my view, we need to be aware of what's going on. There's not necessarily a whole lot that we can do about it directly, but we need to be aware of this potential attempt to neutralize the power of the Supreme Court. And this is not going to happen within the next few years, because most likely after the 2022 elections, the Democrats aren't going to be able to pass any sort of abortion legislation through Congress, because the Republicans are at least going to control the House and potentially the Senate, or the Senate's going to be kind of iffy one way or the other in terms of which party controls it. And in 2024, there's a good chance that Biden's not going to get reelected because of the abysmal state of affairs in our country after this period of time. Now, it could be that Trump runs and he runs against a Republican as an independent, and that splits the vote somehow. It looks to me like the most likely outcome in the 2024 presidential election right now, looking at it a couple years ahead of time, is that Trump may get elected again. Now, things can happen between now and then, and I'm going to make a video about that probably in the future about what I think is going to happen in the 2024 election. But right now, I don't think Biden can get reelected. I don't think the Democrats are going to have the presidency in 2024 or starting at the beginning of 2025. And so my take on it, guys, is that it's going to be a little bit down the road, but if demographic shifts keep happening the way they do, and the Democratic Party is eventually able to have the presidency and both houses of Congress, that's when they could attempt to do this. They could attempt to just push through abortion legislation that tries to guarantee women's right to choose, so to speak, to have abortion of convenience, in other words. And that flies in the face of what the Supreme Court has just ruled. And so then it becomes a question of whether the lower courts are going to go with what they're supposed to go with, which is the ruling from the higher courts, from the Supreme Court itself, or whether they try to protect this federal legislation. And again, this could come down to a state that's not really conservative, not really leftist, and so you have an abortion law on the table that's fairly restrictive, but then you get some leftist judges that basically decide, you know what, we're going to ignore the Supreme Court and say that you have the right to an abortion anyway. If it gets to that point, and consistently we have results like this, where the Supreme Court's authority to interpret the Constitution and basically protect your rights is undermined, once we get to that point, guys, there's no going back. The same thing will happen with free speech. The same thing will happen with due process. The same thing can happen with the right to bear arms. Oh, we're going to ban you owning certain guns. Oh, no, wait, you can't do that, so the Supreme Court rules. Oh, we don't care. We don't care what you say, Supreme Court. You're bad anyway. We're just going to ignore you. Once that's established, you're done. You're not going to have any sort of justice that's based on the Constitution. You're not going to have any of that left anymore. You're just going to have social justice and which group do you fall into, and we're just going to take your rights away at will because the majority of people now think that that's okay because of the media and because of what the left has been able to convince people of. All you have to do is just want it enough politically and convince enough other people that it's okay to take your rights away, and there's nothing left to defend those rights within the constitutional framework because the Supreme Court has had their ability to make rulings neutralized that are actually legally enforced. I fear that this could happen eventually, guys, when the Democratic Party, if they get to a point where they basically have dominance over the federal government and they just basically decide that they're going to defy something like Dobbs, which maybe the other possibility, guys, to just kind of conclude this point, is that they're just trying to hype things up and get their voter base active for the election so that, you know, people that are all for abortion rights will go out and vote for Democrats. But it seems to me like they're kind of serious about this. If you look at the statements of Biden and Pelosi, they want to defy what Dobbs has said. They don't want to do things through the system the way that conservatives did for 50 years before Roe was overturned. They want to just flat out contradict this ruling. And if they're able to do that at any point, that means they can do that with any other issue. The Constitution does not protect abortion rights, in my opinion, but it's clear that it's meant to protect things like due process, free speech, and the right to bear arms. And if they can just say, well, we don't like what the Supreme Court said, we're going to pass this federal legislation anyway, once it gets to that point where they can actually pull that off, we're in a lot of trouble. And I want you all to be aware of that. I want you guys to pay attention to see whether the Democratic Party elites, their leaders basically, push this through. Because if they're successful with that, any constitutional rights that we have that still guarantee us some freedom are pretty much gone at that point. And it's important to know what's going on when this happens, because it looks to me like they're at least going to make that attempt at some point in the future. And that's a major concern for me, to use this Dobbs ruling to try to essentially neutralize the Supreme Court's ability to make rulings on constitutional issues will completely destroy the division of power that our federal government is supposed to have, and will essentially lead to your rights being taken away and you having no constitutional freedoms anymore. And if that's the way events take place in the fairly near future, probably not in 2022, probably not in 2024, But later on, if the Democrats have both the presidency and the Congress, this is going to be a major area of concern, because if they can just ignore the Supreme Court rulings and get lower courts to go along with legislation that is essentially unconstitutional, that means that we don't have any rights left at that point. And I do think that we should at least be aware of this if that is the intent of the leaders of the Democratic Party and the left in general, to use this as an opportunity to take these rights away in the future by just trying to justify ignoring the Supreme Court, basically.